Jake Morrison found the wild stallion bleeding in his doorway during the worst storm of the season, and the horse wasn't running, it was begging him for help. What waited inside his own locked barn, hidden in the shadows where it had no right to be, would put both their lives in danger before sunrise. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the dirt roads of Jake Morrison's ranch into rivers of mud that threatened to wash away everything he had spent 15 years building. He stood on the porch of his weathered barn, watching the storm roll across the Montana Valley with the kind of intensity that made even seasoned ranchers nervous. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the dark silhouettes of his cattle huddled together in the far pasture. And for a moment, Jake wondered if he should have brought them closer to the barn. But the decision was made now, and there was no sense second-guessing himself in weather like this. At 42 years old, Jake had seen his share of storms, both the kind that came from the sky and the kind that came from life itself. He had inherited this ranch from his father 10 years ago, after the old man's heart finally gave out from a lifetime of hard work and harder choices. Since then, Jake had run the place alone, preferring the company of horses and cattle to the complications that came with letting people get too close. His ex-wife had made sure of that, leaving him 3 years into their marriage with nothing but a note on the kitchen table and a bank account that was considerably lighter than it had been the day before. The note had said something about needing more than what a rancher could provide, about dreams that extended beyond fence lines and feeding schedules. Jake had burned it in the fireplace that same night and hadn't looked back since. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and ozone, and Jake pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders. He was about to head inside when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a knife through butter. It was the cry of a horse, high-pitched and desperate, unlike anything his own animals would make. His horses were all accounted for, safely tucked into their stalls on the other side of the barn, but this sound was coming from somewhere out in the darkness beyond his property line. Jake grabbed the flashlight from the hook near the barn door and stepped out into the deluge, his boots immediately sinking into the mud with each step. The rain hit him like thousands of tiny hammers, soaking through his jacket within seconds, but he pushed forward toward the sound. Years of working with animals had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he had was screaming that something was terribly wrong out there in the storm. The cry came again, closer this time, and Jake swept his flashlight across the open ground between his barn and the tree line that marked the edge of his property. The beam caught movement, something large and dark stumbling through the rain about 50 yards away. As he moved closer, his light finally found its target, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat despite all his years of experience with horses. It was a Mustang, a wild stallion from the looks of him, and he was magnificent even in his obvious distress. His coat was the color of storm clouds, that rare blue roan coloring that Jake had only seen a handful of times in his life, and his mane hung long and tangled with burrs and mud. But it was the horse's eyes that captured Jake's attention, dark and intelligent, and filled with something that looked remarkably like pleading. The stallion was favoring his right front leg badly, holding it up at an angle that suggested serious injury, and there was a deep gash along his shoulder that was bleeding freely despite the rain's attempts to wash it clean. Jake had seen wild horses before, had even tried to gentle a few in his younger days, and he knew that approaching one, especially an injured one, was asking for trouble. Wild horses were unpredictable at the best of times, and a stallion in pain was doubly dangerous. But as he stood there in the driving rain, watching this beautiful creature struggle to stay upright, the horse did something that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. The stallion took 3 deliberate steps toward him, each movement clearly causing agony, and then stopped. He lowered his head slightly, not in submission exactly, but in a gesture that seemed almost like a request. Then the horse looked directly at Jake, held his gaze for a long moment and turned his head toward the barn. The movement was unmistakable, deliberate, as if the animal was asking, begging even, to be allowed inside out of the storm. Jake had worked with horses his entire life, had inherited his father's gift for understanding them in ways that other people couldn't quite grasp, but he had never seen anything like this. Wild mustangs didn't approach humans voluntarily. They certainly didn't ask for help. Every book he had ever read, every old cowboy he had ever learned from, had emphasized the same point. Wild horses feared humans above almost everything else. They ran from people, fought them, did everything in their power to avoid contact. Yet here was this injured stallion, clearly wild from the state of him, actively seeking out human intervention. The horse took another painful step forward, and Jake could see him trembling from a combination of pain, exhaustion, and cold. The gash on his shoulder was worse than he had initially thought, deep enough that bone might be visible beneath the torn flesh, and the way the stallion was holding his injured leg suggested a fracture or severe sprain at minimum. Without treatment, the horse would be dead by morning, either from his injuries or from predators that would smell the blood and come looking for an easy meal. Jake made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He moved slowly toward the barn, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and pulled open the large double doors that led into the main structure. The interior was dry and warm compared to the storm outside, lit by the soft glow of the lanterns he had hung earlier that evening. His own horses nickered softly from their stalls, curious about the commotion but not alarmed. The wild stallion watched him from where he stood in the rain, and Jake could see the war happening behind those intelligent dark eyes. Instinct warring with desperation, fear fighting against the need for shelter and help. Then, moving with painful slowness, the horse began to limp toward the open barn doors. Each step seemed to cost him tremendous effort, but he kept coming, kept moving forward with a determination that spoke of iron will beneath the battered exterior. Jake stepped aside as the stallion reached the barn entrance, giving the animal plenty of room to enter without feeling cornered. For a moment, the horse paused at the threshold, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scents of the barn, of domestic horses and hay and grain and all the things that represented human control. Jake held his breath, half expecting the stallion to bolt back into the storm despite his injuries. But instead, the horse took one final step forward and crossed into the barn, his hooves clicking softly on the wooden floor. Before you find out what Jake discovers next, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story has you hooked, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow brings something you won't want to miss. Once inside, the stallion stood trembling in the center of the barn's main aisle, his sides heaving with exhaustion and pain. Up close, Jake could see just how magnificent this animal truly was. Despite the mud caking his coat and the blood matting his shoulder, despite the obvious agony he was in, there was something regal about him, something that spoke of strength and wildness and a spirit that hadn't been broken by whatever had caused these terrible injuries. Jake estimated the horse to be around 6 years old, in his prime, with the kind of muscular build that came from running free across open country and fighting for dominance within a wild herd. Jake moved slowly toward his medical supplies, keeping his movements deliberate and his voice low and soothing. "Easy now, big fella," he murmured, the same tone he used with his own horses when they were frightened or hurt. "I'm gonna help you, but you've got to trust me here." The stallion's ears flicked toward the sound of Jake's voice, tracking his movement, but the horse didn't bolt or try to kick. Instead, he stood still, watching Jake with those impossibly intelligent eyes, as if he understood that this human was his only chance at survival. Jake retrieved his veterinary kit from the tack room, a well-stocked collection of supplies that he had built up over years of handling his own animals' injuries and illnesses. Living this far from town meant that calling a vet for every small problem wasn't practical or economical, so Jake had learned to handle most situations himself. He had set broken legs, stitched wounds, delivered foals, and treated everything from colic to respiratory infections. But looking at this stallion's injuries, he knew he was facing something beyond his usual capabilities. The gash on the shoulder was his first concern. Jake approached from the side, letting the horse see him coming, and gently touched the area around the wound. The stallion flinched but didn't pull away, though his muscles tensed beneath Jake's fingers like coiled springs ready to release. The cut was deep, running nearly 8 inches along the shoulder blade, and Jake could indeed see bone gleaming white beneath the torn flesh. The edges of the wound were ragged rather than clean, suggesting it hadn't been caused by barbed wire or any other man-made object. This looked like it had come from another animal, possibly another horse's hooves during a fight, or perhaps something more sinister. As Jake cleaned the wound with antiseptic, working as gently as possible while the stallion stood with remarkable patience, he noticed something else that made his stomach tighten with unease. There were other injuries, older ones that had partially healed, scattered across the horse's body. Bite marks on his flanks that looked like they had come from a large predator. Scrapes and cuts that suggested he had been running through rough terrain at high speed, possibly being chased. And most disturbing of all, there were marks on his legs that looked suspiciously like rope burns, as if someone had tried to capture this wild horse using methods that were both cruel and illegal. Jake had heard rumors over the past few months about Mustang runners operating in the area, men who captured wild horses illegally to sell them to rendering plants or to buyers who didn't ask too many questions about where the animals came from. The practice was supposedly illegal, protected as the Mustangs were by federal law, but enforcement was spotty in remote areas like this, and the money to be made from selling wild horses was tempting enough that some men were willing to take the risk. Looking at the evidence written across this stallion's body, Jake was becoming increasingly certain that he was seeing the results of such an operation. The horse stood patiently while Jake stitched the shoulder wound, using techniques he had learned from his father and refined through years of practice. 23 stitches in total, each one placed carefully to minimize scarring and maximize the chances of proper healing. The stallion trembled throughout the procedure, his breath coming in short huffs of pain, but he never tried to pull away or strike out at Jake. It was extraordinary behavior for a wild horse, this level of trust, and it only deepened Jake's conviction that something unusual was happening here. When the shoulder was finally bandaged, Jake turned his attention to the injured leg. He ran his hands carefully down the limb, feeling for breaks or fractures, and was relieved to find that the bone seemed intact. The swelling was significant, though, concentrated around the fetlock joint, and the heat radiating from the area suggested serious inflammation. It looked like a bad sprain rather than a break, which meant the horse had a fighting chance if he could be kept still and given time to heal. Jake was wrapping the leg in a support bandage when he heard it, a small sound from the far corner of the barn near the old hay storage area that he rarely used anymore. It was a soft nickering, almost like a baby's cry, and for a moment Jake's mind couldn't make sense of what he was hearing. The stallion's head came up sharply at the sound, his ears pricked forward with sudden intense focus, and he tried to take a step toward the noise despite his injuries. Jake laid a calming hand on the horse's neck and felt the animal's whole body vibrating with tension and what seemed like desperate urgency. Moving cautiously, Jake grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the source of the sound, leaving the stallion standing in the main aisle. The old hay storage area was shadowy and cluttered with equipment he hadn't used in years, and as his flashlight beam swept across the space, it caught movement in the corner. What he saw made him freeze in his tracks, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene before him. Huddled in the corner, half hidden behind an old feed barrel, was a foal. The baby horse couldn't have been more than a few days old, all spindly legs and oversized ears with a coat that matched the stallion's blue roan coloring. The foal was shivering violently, its small body soaked through from the rain, and when Jake's light found it, the baby let out another plaintive cry that was answered immediately by a deep nicker from the stallion behind him. Jake's heart was pounding as the pieces fell into place. The stallion hadn't come to the barn seeking help just for himself. He had come seeking help for his foal, somehow knowing that the baby had taken shelter here, somehow understanding that the human who lived in this place might be able to save them both. But how had the foal gotten here? Jake's barn was locked up tight every night, and he would have noticed if a baby horse had somehow wandered in during the day. Unless the foal had been here longer than just tonight. Unless someone had put it here deliberately. Jake approached the foal slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, and the baby didn't try to run. It was too weak, too cold, too exhausted to do anything but tremble and watch him with enormous, frightened eyes. When he wrapped his jacket around the small, trembling body and lifted the foal into his arms, it weighed almost nothing, far less than it should have. This baby was severely malnourished and dehydrated, and from the look of things, it had been separated from its mother for at least a day, maybe longer. Carrying the foal back to where the stallion waited, Jake watched as the adult horse's entire demeanor changed. The tension drained from his body despite his pain, and he stretched his neck forward to touch his nose to the baby's face, breathing in the foal's scent with obvious relief. The interaction confirmed what Jake had already guessed. This was the stallion's offspring, and the father had traveled who knows how far, injured and in agony, to find help for his baby. Jake set the foal down gently on a bed of clean straw in an empty stall, and the stallion immediately limped over to stand guard, positioning himself between Jake and the baby with protective instinct that transcended his injuries. But there was no aggression in the horse's posture, just watchful concern, as if he was checking to make sure Jake understood the importance of what had been entrusted to him. The immediate priority was getting the foal warm and hydrated. Jake retrieved several thick horse blankets from his storage closet and wrapped them around the baby's small, shivering body, then set up a heat lamp in the corner of the stall to provide additional warmth. The foal's temperature was dangerously low, and Jake knew that hypothermia could kill a newborn horse faster than starvation. As he worked, the stallion watched every movement with intense focus, occasionally nickering softly to the baby as if offering reassurance. Jake mixed up a bottle of electrolyte solution, the kind he kept on hand for sick calves, and carefully tried to get the foal to drink. At first, the baby turned its head away, too weak or too frightened to cooperate, but Jake was patient. He had raised orphaned foals before, knew the delicate balance required to save a baby horse that had been separated from its mother. After several attempts, the foal finally latched onto the bottle and began to drink, its small throat working with desperate hunger. Jake felt the stallion's hot breath on the back of his neck as the adult horse leaned over him, watching to make sure the human was taking proper care of his offspring. The rain continued to hammer against the barn roof, creating a steady drumbeat that filled the space with white noise. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and Jake was grateful that both horses had made it to shelter when they did. He couldn't stop thinking about the mystery of how the foal had ended up in his barn. The building had been locked up tight when he had finished his evening chores around 5 o'clock, and he had been in the house ever since, watching the storm roll in from his kitchen window. There was no way a foal could have wandered in on its own during that time, which meant someone had put it there deliberately. As the baby finished the bottle and began to drowse in the warmth of the blankets, Jake stood and walked back to the area where he had found the foal. His flashlight beam swept across the cluttered space more carefully this time, looking for clues he might have missed in his initial shock at discovering the baby horse. What he found made his blood run cold. Tucked behind the feed barrel, partially hidden beneath an old tarp, was a canvas bag that definitely hadn't been there before. Jake picked up the bag with careful hands, noting its weight and the way something inside shifted and clinked. When he opened it, he found himself staring at evidence that confirmed his worst suspicions about what had happened to these horses. Inside were several lengths of rope, still damp from the rain, with dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. There was also a branding iron, the the kind used by ranchers to mark their cattle. But this one bore no legitimate ranch brand. Instead, it had been crudely modified, the metal twisted into a symbol that Jake recognized from wanted posters he had seen at the sheriff's office in town. The symbol belonged to the Garrett brothers, a pair of men who had been operating an illegal Mustang running operation throughout Montana and Wyoming for the past 2 years. They captured wild horses using brutal methods, often separating foals from their mothers to make the adults easier to handle, then sold the horses to slaughterhouses or unscrupulous buyers who didn't ask questions. The authorities had been trying to catch them for months, but the Garretts were clever, always staying one step ahead of the law, operating in remote areas where they were unlikely to be seen or reported. Jake's hands tightened on the bag as understanding flooded through him. The Garretts must have captured this stallion and his foal, probably along with other members of their herd. Something had gone wrong during the capture, resulting in the stallion's injuries as he fought to protect his family. The foal had somehow been separated in the chaos and ended up here in Jake's barn, possibly placed there by someone who wanted to hide evidence or was planning to come back for it later. The stallion, injured and desperate, had tracked his baby's scent here and come begging for help from the only human he could find, but that raised another disturbing question. If the Garretts had been on Jake's property, using his barn to stash a stolen foal, that meant they knew about his ranch and had chosen it deliberately. It also meant they might come back, and when they did, they would expect to find the foal right where they had left it. Jake looked at the injured stallion and the sleeping baby and felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in his chest. These horses had trusted him, had come to him for help, and there was no way he was going to let the Garrett brothers take them. The sound of a truck engine in the distance made Jake freeze. It was after midnight now, and nobody had any business being on the roads out here during a storm like this, unless they were up to something they didn't want witnessed. He killed the barn lights, plunging the interior into darkness except for the soft glow of the heat lamp in the foal's stall, and moved to the small window that overlooked his driveway. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see headlights approaching, moving slowly as if the driver was searching for something. The truck pulled up near the barn and killed its engine, and 2 men climbed out into the rain. Even at this distance and in the poor visibility, Jake could see they were both armed, rifles slung over their shoulders with the casual ease of men who were comfortable with violence. They spoke to each other briefly, their voices too low to carry over the storm. Then one of them pointed toward the barn while the other nodded in agreement. They were coming for the foal, and they clearly didn't expect any resistance from whoever owned this property. Jake's mind raced through his options. He could call the sheriff, but his phone was in the house, and these men would be in the barn before anyone could arrive to help. He could try to hide the horses, but there was nowhere in the barn that wouldn't be immediately obvious, and the stallion was too injured to move far anyway. That left only one real option, and it was one that made his stomach tighten with a mixture of fear and grim determination. He was going to have to confront these men himself and buy enough time for help to arrive. Moving quickly but quietly, Jake retrieved his rifle from the tack room, a Winchester that had belonged to his father and that Jake kept meticulously maintained, even though he rarely had occasion to use it. He checked that it was loaded, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, then positioned himself near the barn's main entrance where he would have the advantage of cover and surprise. Behind him, the stallion sensed the change in atmosphere and moved to stand over his sleeping foal, his ears pinned back and his eyes reflecting the dim light with an almost predatory gleam. The barn door handle rattled as someone tested it from outside, finding it locked as Jake always kept it. There was a moment of silence, then the sharp crack of wood splintering as one of the men kicked the door hard enough to break the latch. The door swung open, and the 2 men stepped inside out of the rain, their rifles held ready but not aimed, clearly expecting an empty barn and an easy retrieval of their stolen goods. Jake stepped out from behind the partition where he had been waiting, his own rifle leveled at the 2 intruders. His voice was calm and steady when he spoke. betraying none of the fear that was making his heart pound against his ribs. "Evening, gentlemen. This is private property, and you're trespassing. I suggest you turn around and leave before this situation gets any worse than it already is." The two men froze, clearly surprised to find themselves facing an armed rancher when they had expected no resistance. The one in front was tall and rangy with a scar running down his left cheek, while his companion was shorter but built like a bull, all muscle and aggression. The tall one recovered first, his mouth curving into a smile that held no warmth. "We don't want any trouble, friend. We're just here to collect some property that belongs to us. There's a foal in this barn that we need to retrieve, and then we'll be on our way." "That foal doesn't belong to you," Jake replied, his rifle never wavering. "It's a wild Mustang, protected by federal law, and from the looks of things, you boys have been running an illegal capture operation. The bag of equipment you left behind makes for pretty compelling evidence, and I'm sure the sheriff would love to have a conversation with you about it." The smile disappeared from the tall man's face, replaced by something cold and calculating. The shorter one shifted his weight, his hand tightening on his rifle, and Jake could see the situation balanced on a knife's edge. These were men who made their living outside the law, who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood between them and their profits. The tension in the barn was thick enough to cut, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional soft nicker from the stallion behind him. "Now listen here," the tall one said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "We've got a significant investment in that foal and its herd. We've spent weeks tracking those Mustangs, and we're not about to walk away empty-handed because some rancher decided to play hero. You're outnumbered and outgunned, friend. The smart thing to do would be to put down that rifle and let us take what's ours." Jake had been in tight situations before, had faced down angry bulls and spooked horses and men who thought their size gave them the right to push others around. But he had never found himself in a genuine life-or-death standoff, and he could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the cold air coming through the broken barn door. Still, when he spoke, his voice remained steady, channeling the same calm authority his father had always used when dealing with difficult situations. "The foal stays here along with the stallion that came looking for it, and you two are going to leave my property right now, or I'm going to start shooting, and we'll let the law sort out who was in the right when they find your bodies in my barn. I've got witnesses in town who know about the illegal Mustang running in this area, and I've got the evidence you left behind. You really want to add murder to your list of charges?" The two brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. For a moment, Jake thought they might actually back down, might decide that one foal wasn't worth the risk of a gunfight. Then the shorter one moved, bringing his rifle up in a smooth practice motion that spoke of military training or years of hunting. Jake's finger tightened on his trigger, knowing he had perhaps a second to react before this turned deadly. The gunshot that rang out was deafening in the enclosed space of the barn, but it didn't come from any of the three men. Instead, it came from the open barn door behind the Garrett brothers, where a figure stood silhouetted against the rain-dark night. The shorter brother's rifle flew from his hands as the bullet struck it, sending the weapon clattering across the barn floor, and both men spun around to face this new threat. "I'd do what the man says if I were you," a woman's voice called out, calm and authoritative despite the storm raging around her. "Drop your weapons and get on your knees, hands behind your heads. And before you get any ideas about being heroes, you should know that I've got 3 more deputies positioned around this property, all of them with clear shots at this barn." Jake felt a surge of relief as he recognized the voice. Sheriff Sarah Chen had only been in the position for about a year, having moved to Montana from Seattle after her husband's death, but she had already earned a reputation as someone who didn't tolerate lawlessness in her county. She stepped into the barn now, her service weapon trained on the two brothers, rain dripping from her wide-brimmed hat and her expression hard as granite. The tall Garrett brother looked like he was considering his options, weighing the odds of making a break for it against the reality of facing multiple armed law enforcement officers. His hand twitched toward the knife Jake could see strapped to his belt, but the sheriff's voice cut through his deliberation like a blade. "Don't even think about it, Marcus. I've been tracking you and your brother for 6 months, and I've got enough evidence to put you both away for 10 years minimum. Illegal capture and transport of protected wildlife, animal cruelty, trespassing, destruction of property, and now we can add attempted theft and threatening a civilian with a deadly weapon. Your operation is done, and so are you." "How did you know I was here?" Jake asked, not taking his eyes off the brothers as they reluctantly knelt and placed their hands behind their heads. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called the station about an hour ago," Sarah replied, moving forward to handcuff the 2 men with efficient movements. "She saw these 2 driving onto your property and thought it was suspicious given the late hour and the storm. When I ran the plates on their truck, they came back registered to a known associate of the Garretts, so I figured it was worth checking out." Jake lowered his rifle, his arms trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. Behind him, he could hear the stallion moving restlessly in the stall, disturbed by the gunshot and the presence of so many strangers. The foal let out a small, frightened whinny, and Jake turned to see the baby struggling to stand on shaky legs, confused and scared by all the commotion. "There's more you need to know, Sheriff," Jake said, gesturing toward the stall. "These 2 didn't just trespass on my property. They've been running an illegal Mustang capture operation, and I've got evidence to prove it." Over the next few minutes, as Sarah's deputies arrived to transport the Garrett brothers to jail, Jake showed her everything he had found. The bag of equipment, the rope with bloodstains, the modified branding iron with a distinctive symbol. He explained about finding the foal in his barn, about the stallion arriving injured and desperate, about piecing together what must have happened during the capture gone wrong. Sarah photographed everything with meticulous care, her expression growing darker as the full scope of the Garrett brothers' operation became clear. "This is enough to put them away for a long time," she said, sealing the evidence bags. "And with the federal charges that will come from capturing protected Mustangs, they'll be facing serious prison time." "What happens to the horses?" Jake asked, the question that had been weighing on him since the moment he had discovered the foal. Sarah looked past him to where the stallion stood guard over his baby, the adult horse's eyes still wary but no longer showing the desperate terror that had driven him to seek human help. Normally, they would go to a Bureau of Land Management holding facility until they could be released back to the wild. But given the stallion's injuries and the foal's condition, I'm not sure they would survive the transport and processing. Jake felt his heart sink. He had saved these horses from the Garrett brothers, only to lose them to bureaucratic procedure and government facilities that were notoriously overcrowded and underfunded. The thought of that magnificent stallion, who had shown such incredible intelligence and trust by coming here for help, ending up in a holding pen somewhere, felt fundamentally wrong. "What if I kept them here?" he heard himself saying. "Just temporarily, until they're healthy enough to be released properly. I've got the space and the resources to care for them, and the stallion already trusts me enough to let me treat his injuries." Sarah considered this, her eyes moving between Jake and the horses. "It would require paperwork," she said slowly. "Permits from BLM, regular inspections to ensure the animals are being properly cared for, documentation of their medical treatment and recovery progress. And you'd have to agree to release them back to the wild once they're healthy. No attempts to domesticate or keep them permanently." "I understand," Jake said. "I just want to give them a chance to heal without adding more trauma on top of what they've already been through." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then she pulled out a card from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. "There's a woman at the BLM office in Helena who handles these kinds of special cases. Her name is Dr. Rebecca Torres, and she's reasonable about working with private citizens when it serves the animal's best interests. Give her a call tomorrow, and explain the situation. I'll send her my report to back up your request." After the deputies had taken the Garrett brothers away and Sarah had finished collecting her evidence, Jake found himself alone in the barn once again, with just the horses and the sound of rain that was finally beginning to ease. The storm was breaking up, the worst of it having passed while the confrontation was unfolding, and through the broken barn door, Jake could see the first hints of moonlight breaking through the clouds. He walked to the stall where the foal lay curled up in the straw, finally warm and fed and safe, with the stallion standing watch over his baby like a sentinel. The adult horse looked at Jake with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and for a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw gratitude there, understanding that this human had protected his offspring when it mattered most. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the Montana mountains when Jake finally allowed himself to sit down on an overturned bucket outside the stall, exhaustion catching up with him now that the adrenaline had worn off. He had been awake for nearly 24 hours, and every muscle in his body ached from the tension of the night's events, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the barn, not when these horses still needed him, not when the stallion was still watching him with those eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul. Jake had spent the hours after the sheriff's departure tending to the animals with meticulous care. He had changed the stallion's bandages, cleaned the stitches on his shoulder wound, and administered antibiotics that he kept on hand for his own livestock. The horse had stood patiently through it all, only flinching when Jake's ministrations caused unavoidable pain, and never once attempting to bite or kick, despite having every reason to be fearful of human touch after what the Garrett brothers had put him through. The foal had needed attention too. Jake had given the baby another bottle, marveling at how eagerly the little one drank this time, no longer too weak or frightened to accept nourishment. After feeding, he had carefully examined the foal for injuries, running his hands over the small body and finding evidence of rough handling, but nothing that appeared life-threatening. There were rope burns around the foal's neck and legs, signs that the baby had been forcibly separated from its mother and restrained, but the wounds were superficial and would heal with time and proper care. As Jake sat there watching the horses, his mind wandered to thoughts he usually kept locked away in the parts of his heart that hurt too much to examine closely. This was the most alive he had felt in 3 years, since before his marriage had fallen apart, since before he had retreated into the solitary existence of running his ranch alone. There was something about caring for these magnificent animals, about being trusted by them despite every reason they had to fear humans, that awakened parts of himself he thought had died with his divorce. His ex-wife, Rachel, had wanted children. That had been one of the central conflicts of their marriage. Her desperate desire to start a family set against his reluctance to bring kids into a life that he knew from experience could be brutally hard and unpredictable. Jake's own childhood had been marked by his mother's death when he was 12, killed in a riding accident that had left his father a broken shell of a man. Jake had watched his father retreat into grief and alcohol, had essentially raised himself through his teenage years while keeping the ranch running, and he had sworn he would never risk inflicting that kind of pain on a child of his own. Rachel had tried to understand at first, had accepted his reassurances that maybe someday he would be ready. But someday had never come, and eventually her patience had run out. The note she had left had been brief and devastating in its simplicity. "I can't spend my life waiting for you to stop being afraid of living it," she had written. "I deserve more than a husband who keeps me at arm's length because he's terrified of losing what we have. I'm sorry, Jake, but I'm done waiting." Looking at the stallion and his foal now, watching the fierce protective love that drove the father to risk everything for his baby's safety, Jake felt something crack open inside his chest. This wild horse, who had never known the safety of human care, who had every reason to fear and hate people after what had been done to him, had still found the courage to ask for help when his child needed it. What did it say about Jake that a wild Mustang had more courage to face fear for the sake of love than he had shown in his entire marriage? The stallion shifted his weight, the movement drawing Jake's attention back to the present. The horse was favoring his injured leg less now, the anti-inflammatory medication Jake had given him starting to take effect, but it would be weeks before he was fully healed. Weeks during which these horses would be dependent on Jake's care, weeks during which he would have the responsibility of keeping them safe and healthy and preparing them for eventual release back to the wild. Jake stood up and walked to his small office at the back of the barn, a cluttered space filled with veterinary supplies, ranch records, and the accumulated debris of 15 years of solitary living. He found the card that Sheriff Chen had given him and stared at it for a long moment. Dr. Rebecca Torres, Bureau of Land Management. He had never dealt with federal agencies before, had always prided himself on being self-sufficient and not needing help from anyone. But this situation was beyond his expertise, beyond what he could handle alone, and he knew it. The clock on the wall showed it was just after 6 in the morning. Too early to call anyone at a government office, so Jake made himself a pot of strong coffee and settled in to wait. He used the time to document everything that had happened, writing out a detailed account of finding the foal, treating the stallion's injuries, the confrontation with the Garrett brothers, and the current condition of both horses. Dr. Torres would want facts and evidence, and Jake was determined to present the strongest possible case for being allowed to keep the horses here during their recovery. While he worked, his own horses began to stir in their stalls, nickering their morning greetings and reminding him that the normal ranch work still needed to be done, regardless of the extraordinary events of the previous night. Jake went through his usual routine on autopilot, feeding his own animals, checking water troughs, letting the horses out into their paddocks for their daily exercise. His body moved through the familiar motions while his mind remained focused on the wild stallion and foal who had so unexpectedly entered his life. When he returned to check on his wild charges, he found the foal standing on wobbly legs, nursing from a bottle that Jake had rigged up to hang from the stall wall at the appropriate height. The baby had figured out how to feed himself, showing an intelligence and adaptability that spoke well for his chances of survival. The stallion stood nearby, his eyes half closed in what might have been rest or might have been careful watchfulness. It was hard to tell with a wild horse that had learned to sleep lightly and wake at the first sign of danger. At precisely 9 o'clock, Jake dialed the number on Dr. Torres's card. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, professional but with an underlying warmth that immediately put Jake at ease. "This is Dr. Torres. How can I help you?" Jake took a deep breath and began to explain. He told her everything, from the moment he had heard the stallion's cry in the storm, to the arrest of the Garrett brothers, to his current request to provide temporary sanctuary for the horses during their recovery. He described the stallion's injuries in clinical detail, explained the foal's malnourished condition, and made it clear that he understood these were wild animals that would eventually need to be returned to their natural habitat. Dr. Torres listened without interrupting, and when Jake finished, there was a long moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then she said something that surprised him. "Mr. Morrison, I've been working with wild horses for 15 years, and I've never heard of a Mustang stallion voluntarily seeking out human help. What you're describing is extraordinary behavior, the kind of intelligence and adaptability that we rarely see even in domestic horses. These animals chose you, and that means something." Jake felt something tighten in his chest at her words. He had been so focused on the practical aspects of the situation, on treating injuries and protecting the horses from the Garrett brothers, that he hadn't fully processed the profound nature of what had happened. A wild stallion, an animal that should have viewed all humans as mortal enemies after being tortured and hunted, had instead made the conscious decision to trust him. The weight of that trust settled on Jake's shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy of wearing. "I'll need to come out and assess the situation in person," Dr. Torres continued, her tone becoming more businesslike. "I can be there tomorrow afternoon if that works for you. In the meantime, I'm going to grant you temporary emergency custody of both animals. That will give you legal protection if anyone questions why you have wild mustangs on your property, and it will allow you to continue providing medical care without worrying about federal violations." Jake gave her directions to the ranch and hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. He had bought himself some time, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. The stallion's injuries were severe enough that full recovery would take months, not weeks, and the foal needed constant care and monitoring to ensure he gained weight and strength properly. And beyond the physical healing, there was the question of what would happen when these wild horses were healthy enough to return to their lives on the range. Would they even want to go back after experiencing the safety and regular feeding that came with human care? The day passed in a blur of activity. Jake moved between his regular ranch duties and caring for his wild charges, finding a rhythm that allowed him to manage both without sacrificing either. He fed the foal every 3 hours, gradually increasing the amount of formula as the baby's appetite grew stronger. The little one was responding well to care, his coat beginning to show the glossy sheen of health instead of the dull roughness of malnutrition, and his movements becoming more coordinated as strength returned to his spindly legs. The stallion was a different challenge altogether. His physical wounds were healing well under Jake's careful treatment, the shoulder gash showing no signs of infection, and the swelling in his leg gradually decreasing. But there was something in the horse's eyes that spoke of deeper wounds, the kind that couldn't be stitched or bandaged. This was an animal that had experienced betrayal at human hands, that had been hunted and hurt and separated from his herd. The fact that he tolerated Jake's presence at all was remarkable, but tolerance was a long way from trust. Jake found himself talking to the stallion as he worked, keeping up a steady stream of quiet conversation that seemed to soothe the horse's nerves. He told the stallion about the ranch, about his own horses and the cattle that grazed in the far pastures. He talked about the weather and the mountains and the way the valley looked when wildflowers bloomed in spring. And sometimes, when he was sure no one else could hear, he talked about Rachel and the marriage that had failed, about his fears and regrets, and the loneliness that had become his constant companion. The stallion would stand very still during these one-sided conversations, his ears swiveling toward Jake's voice, and occasionally he would let out a soft snort that might have been acknowledgement or might have been simple coincidence. But Jake chose to believe it was the former. Chose to believe that this wild creature understood on some level that the man caring for him was also wounded, also healing from injuries that went deeper than flesh. By late afternoon, Jake's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stopped by with a casserole and an abundance of curiosity. She was a widow in her 70s who had lived on the adjacent property for as long as Jake could remember, and she had appointed herself his unofficial caretaker after Rachel left, regularly appearing with home-cooked meals and unsolicited advice about his bachelor lifestyle. "I heard about the excitement last night," she said, bustling into his kitchen without waiting for an invitation. "Sarah Chen called me this morning to thank me for reporting those men on your property. Said you had quite the adventure with wild horses and criminals and gunfights." She set the casserole down on the counter and fixed Jake with a penetrating stare. "You could have been killed, Jake Morrison." "I had it under control," Jake replied, though they both knew that was only partially true. "And I'm grateful you called the sheriff when you did. Your timing probably saved my life." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "Can I see them? The horses everyone's talking about? I've lived in Montana my whole life and never seen a wild Mustang up close." Jake led her out to the barn, watching her face as she caught her first glimpse of the stallion. The horse was standing in his stall, with his head held high, every line of his body radiating wild dignity despite his injuries and confinement. The foal was pressed against his father's side, peering at the newcomers with huge, curious eyes. "Oh my," Mrs. Patterson breathed, her hand going to her heart. He's magnificent. I've never seen anything like him, and that baby, Jake, that baby looks just like him. Blue roan coloring like that is rare even in domestic horses. These two must be special." "They are," Jake said quietly. "The stallion came here on his own, injured and desperate, asking for help. I've worked with horses my entire life, and I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Patterson was silent for a long moment, studying the horses with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. Then she turned to him and said something that cut straight through all his carefully maintained defenses. "You know, Jake, I think maybe these horses didn't just come here for physical healing. I think maybe they came here for you too, to remind you that trust and love are still possible even after you've been hurt." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, and he found himself blinking back unexpected tears. Mrs. Patterson had always been perceptive, but this observation went straight to the heart of everything he had been feeling since the stallion first appeared in his barn. These horses had chosen him not just because his was the nearest shelter, but because somehow they sensed he would help them. And in helping them, he was discovering parts of himself that he thought had died with his marriage. After Mrs. Patterson left, Jake returned to the barn and found the stallion watching him with those impossibly intelligent dark eyes. The horse nickered softly, a sound that seemed almost like a greeting, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. He approached the stall slowly, talking in low, soothing tones, and extended his hand palm up in a gesture of offering rather than demand. For a long moment, the stallion just stared at Jake's outstretched hand. Then slowly, carefully, the horse stretched his neck forward and touched his nose to Jake's palm. The contact lasted only a second before the stallion pulled back, but it was enough. It was trust, freely given by a creature that had every reason to withhold it, and Jake felt the weight of that gift settle into his bones. That night, Jake moved a cot into the barn so he could be close if either horse needed him during the dark hours. He lay there listening to the quiet sounds of the animals around him, the soft breathing of his domestic horses in their stalls, the occasional movement of the stallion shifting his weight, the small contented sounds the foal made in his sleep. Outside, the world was dark and quiet, the storm of the previous night having blown itself out to leave behind air that was clean and clear and full of possibility. Dr. Rebecca Torres arrived at the ranch just after 2 in the afternoon, driving a government-issued truck with the Bureau of Land Management logo on the door. She was younger than Jake had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered tan that came from spending most of your working life outdoors. When she shook Jake's hand, her grip was firm and her eyes were sharp with the kind of intelligence that missed very little. "Show me what you've got," she said without preamble, and Jake appreciated her directness. He had dealt with enough bureaucrats over the years to know that the ones who got straight to business were usually the ones worth talking to. He led her to the barn, explaining his treatment protocol as they walked. He detailed the antibiotics he had administered, the care he had taken with the shoulder wound, the gradual improvement in the stallion's leg mobility. Dr. Torres listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that revealed her extensive knowledge of equine medicine and wild horse behavior. When they reached the stall, the stallion's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His head came up sharply, his ears pinned back, and his entire body tensed with fight-or-flight instinct. The foal scrambled to his feet and pressed against his father's side, both animals radiating wariness at the presence of this new human. It was a stark contrast to the relative calm they showed around Jake, and Dr. Torres noticed immediately. "He's completely comfortable with you," she observed, making notes on a tablet she had pulled from her bag. "But I'm a threat. That's exactly what I would expect from a wild horse that's had minimal human contact. The fact that he trusts you enough to let you in his space is remarkable." Jake approached the stall slowly, talking to the stallion in the low, soothing voice that had become their private language. "Easy there, big guy," She's here to help, just like me. Nobody's going to hurt you or your baby." The horse's ears swiveled toward Jake's voice, and some of the tension drained from his posture, though he kept a wary eye on Dr. Torres. "May I examine them?" she asked. "I'll stay outside the stall if that makes him more comfortable, but I need to verify their condition for my report." Jake nodded and stepped aside, watching as Dr. Torres conducted a thorough visual examination from outside the stall. She photographed the stallion's injuries from multiple angles, documented the foal's body condition and approximate age, and took careful notes about everything she observed. Her professionalism was evident in every movement, but Jake could see something else in her expression too, a kind of wonder and respect that suggested she understood just how special these animals were. "The stallion is approximately 6 to 7 years old," she said, reviewing her notes. "Based on his build and coloring, I'd guess he's from the prior mountain herd. That's about 100 miles from here, which means he traveled a significant distance while injured to find this foal. The bond between them must be extraordinary." "Can you tell if the foal is his offspring?" Jake asked. "I assumed he was the father, but I don't actually know for certain." Dr. Torres studied both horses carefully. "The coloring is nearly identical, and the facial structure is similar enough to suggest a genetic relationship. But more than that, look at their behavior. That's a stallion protecting his foal. A Mustang stallion wouldn't show that level of protective behavior toward another horse's offspring. They're definitely father and son." Something about hearing it confirmed made the situation feel more real to Jake. This wasn't just a wild horse and a random baby he was caring for. This was a family, broken apart by human cruelty and fighting desperately to stay together. The responsibility of that weighed on him in a way that was both daunting and strangely comforting. Dr. Torres spent the next hour conducting her assessment, checking Jake's medical supplies, reviewing his treatment records, and asking detailed questions about his experience with horses. She examined the evidence from the Garrett brothers' capture operation, photographing everything for the federal case that was being built against them. Finally, she sat down with Jake in his small barn office and delivered her verdict. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're proposing to do here, caring for these wild horses through their recovery, is going to be difficult. The stallion's injuries are severe enough that full healing will take at least 4 to 6 months. The foal needs constant monitoring and feeding for the next several weeks until he's strong enough to graze on his own. You'll need to file weekly reports with my office, allow regular inspections, and agree to strict protocols about handling and care." Jake nodded, unsurprised by any of this. "I understand. I'm prepared to do whatever's necessary." "But here's the thing," Dr. Torres continued, leaning forward with an intensity that caught Jake's attention. "I've worked with wild horses my entire career, and I've seen what happens when they're put through the standard BLM processing system. They lose something fundamental about themselves. They become broken versions of what they once were, even the ones we eventually release back to the wild. Looking at that stallion, seeing the intelligence and spirit he still has despite everything he's been through, I don't want that to happen to him." "So what are you saying?" Jake asked. "I'm saying that I'm going to approve your request to provide long-term sanctuary for these horses during their recovery. I'm going to give you 6 months, with the possibility of extension if needed to get them healthy enough for release, and I'm going to trust you to do this right, to respect their wild nature while providing the care they need to heal." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "The paperwork is going to be a nightmare, but I think these horses are worth it." Relief flooded through Jake, so intense it almost made him dizzy. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more deeply than he could express. "I won't let you down." Dr. Torres stood and extended her hand. "I know you won't. I've learned to trust my instincts about people, Mr. Morrison, and my instincts tell me that these horses couldn't have found a better person to help them." She glanced back toward the stall, where the stallion stood watching them. "Besides, he already made his choice. Who am I to argue with a horse that smart?" After Dr. Torres left, Jake returned to the stall and found the stallion visibly more relaxed now that the stranger was gone. The foal was nursing from his bottle, his small tail swishing with contentment, and the scene was so peaceful that Jake felt something in his chest loosen and expand. 6 months. He had 6 months with these horses, 6 months to help them heal and grow strong enough to return to the wild where they belonged. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Jake felt a pang of something that might have been grief. 6 months seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. How was he supposed to care for these animals, grow attached to them, earn their trust, and then just let them go? How was he supposed to open his heart to something knowing from the beginning that it was temporary? The irony wasn't lost on him. This was exactly what Rachel had accused him of during their marriage. His inability to fully commit because he was always holding back part of himself against the possibility of loss. She had wanted all of him, wanted him to risk everything for their relationship, and he had been too afraid. Now here he was, preparing to do exactly that for a pair of wild horses that would inevitably leave him. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and oddly fulfilling. Jake's days began before dawn with the foal's first feeding, continued through the endless cycle of ranch work and medical care, and often didn't end until well after midnight, when he would finally collapse on his cot in the barn, too tired to make the walk back to the house. Mrs. Patterson scolded him regularly about neglecting his own health, appearing with increasingly elaborate meals that she insisted he eat while she watched to make sure he actually finished them. The foal was thriving under Jake's constant attention. The little one had gained nearly 40 pounds in the first 3 weeks, his ribs no longer visible beneath his glossy coat, and his legs had lost their spindly weakness. Jake had named him Storm, both for the tempest that had brought him into Jake's life and for the wild spirit that was already beginning to show in the young horse's personality. Storm was curious about everything, investigating every corner of his stall with his nose, nickering at the other horses, and developing a particular fondness for the pockets of Jake's jacket where he had learned treats were sometimes hidden. The stallion was a different story altogether. His physical injuries were healing well, the shoulder wound had closed cleanly, and was now just an angry red scar that would eventually fade to white. The swelling in his leg had gone down completely, and he was bearing weight on it normally again. But the psychological wounds were taking longer to mend. The horse remained wary of everyone except Jake, and even with Jake, there were boundaries that couldn't be crossed. He would allow Jake to treat his injuries and feed him, would tolerate Jake's presence in the stall with Storm, but any attempt to touch him beyond what was medically necessary was met with pinned ears and a warning nicker. Jake had stopped trying to force the issue. He understood, perhaps better than most people would, that trust couldn't be demanded or rushed. It had to be earned through patience and consistency and time. So he continued his routine, talking to the stallion as he worked, respecting the horse's space, while making it clear that he was there whenever the animal was ready to accept more. It was Sheriff Chen who gave Jake the news about the Garrett brothers. She stopped by on a cold November morning, her breath misting in the air as she climbed out of her patrol car. The brothers had been formally charged with multiple counts of illegal capture and transport of protected wildlife, animal cruelty, trespassing, and assault with a deadly weapon. They were facing federal charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences, and the evidence was strong enough that their public defender was already talking about plea bargains. "There's something else you should know," Sarah said, accepting the coffee Jake offered and warming her hands on the mug. "We found their operation base about 60 miles from here. They had been capturing Mustangs for at least 3 years, selling them to buyers who shipped them to slaughter facilities across the border. We estimate they took close to 200 horses during that time." The number made Jake feel sick. 200 wild horses, ripped from their families and herds, transported in terrible conditions to meet brutal ends. And Storm and his father, had been destined for the same fate if the stallion hadn't been smart enough and desperate enough to seek help. We also found evidence of what happened to Storm's mother, Sarah continued gently. The mare was killed during the initial capture. It looks like she fought to protect her foal and the stallion, and one of the Garretts shot her. That's probably when the stallion received his injuries, trying to defend his family. Jake set down his coffee mug carefully, not trusting his hands to remain steady. That magnificent horse in his barn had watched his mate die, had been wounded trying to save her, and then had tracked his stolen foal across miles of rough country to find help. The depth of devotion and intelligence required for such a feat was staggering. "How did Storm end up in my barn?" Jake asked. "I still don't understand that part. The Garretts needed a place to stash him temporarily while they went back for more horses from the herd. Your barn was unlocked that day. You were in town for supplies, and they figured it was as good a place as any to hide a foal for a few hours. They didn't count on the stallion tracking the baby's scent here, or on you coming back early and discovering everything." After Sarah left, Jake walked back to the barn, feeling the weight of everything these horses had survived pressing down on him. Storm was playing in his stall, his small hooves kicking up straw as he discovered the joy of having enough energy for foolishness. The stallion watched his son with an expression that Jake could only describe as paternal pride, and for a moment Jake saw not a wild animal, but a father who had lost everything to save his child. "Jake," he said quietly, his voice echoing in the empty barn. "That's what I'm going to call you. Not Storm's father, not the stallion, but Jake, like me. Two survivors learning to trust again." The horse's ears swiveled toward the sound of his name, and though he gave no other sign of acknowledgement, Jake liked to think that somewhere in that intelligent mind, the stallion understood. As winter settled over Montana in earnest, Jake found himself falling into a routine that felt more like a life than mere existence. He still did his regular ranch work, but now there was something to come back to beyond empty rooms and solitary dinners. The wild horses needed him, depended on him, and in caring for them he discovered parts of himself that he thought had been lost forever. Mrs. Patterson noticed the change first. "You're different," she announced one afternoon while watching Jake work with Storm in the barn. "Lighter somehow. Less like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Jake paused in his task of teaching Storm to lead on a halter, something the foal would need to know for his eventual veterinary checks and transport back to the wild. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. "You're happy," Mrs. Patterson said simply. "For the first time since Rachel left, you're genuinely happy. Those horses are healing you as much as you're healing them." That night, as Jake lay on his cot listening to the sounds of the barn settling for sleep, he allowed himself to think about Rachel for the first time in months, without the accompanying spike of pain and regret. He had loved her, still loved her in a way, but he could see now that they had been wrong for each other in fundamental ways that no amount of effort could have fixed. She had needed someone who could give themselves completely to the future without being haunted by the past, and he had needed time to learn that lesson that loving something didn't mean you were guaranteed to lose it. The stallion nickered softly from his stall, and Storm answered with his own small voice. Father and son, together despite everything that had tried to tear them apart. Jake thought about the courage it must have taken for the stallion to seek human help, to override every instinct that screamed danger in favor of the desperate hope that someone might save his child. That was love in its purest form, the willingness to risk everything for something that mattered more than your own safety. Maybe that was the lesson Jake needed to learn. Not that loving meant inevitable loss, but that refusing to love guaranteed a different kind of loss, the slow death of hope and connection and everything that made life worth living. The stallion had risked everything and won. Maybe it was time for Jake to do the same. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A truck pulled up to the ranch around 10, and Jake watched through his kitchen window as a woman climbed out, followed by 2 children, a girl of about 8, and a boy who looked to be 5 or 6. They stood uncertainly in his driveway until Jake went out to meet them. The woman was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that held the kind of weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. She extended her hand to Jake with a nervous smile. "Mr. Morrison? I'm Amanda Martinez. I hope we're not intruding. Sheriff Chen told me about the wild horses you're caring for, and I was hoping we could see them. My children have been asking about them non-stop since they heard the story at school." Jake glanced at the kids, who were watching him with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The girl had her arm around her younger brother's shoulders in a protective gesture that reminded Jake painfully of the stallion standing guard over Storm. "Of course," he said, finding himself smiling despite his usual reluctance to have visitors. "Come on back to the barn. Just remember these are wild animals, so we need to be quiet and respectful of their space." As they walked toward the barn, Amanda explained that she had moved to the area 6 months ago after her husband's death in a construction accident. She was trying to build a new life for her family, working as a teacher at the local elementary school while raising her 2 children alone. The kids had been struggling with the move and the loss of their father, but the story of the wild stallion who saved his baby had captured their imaginations in a way that nothing else had since the tragedy. "My son, Tommy, hasn't spoken much since his father died," Amanda said quietly as the children ran ahead toward the barn. "But last night at dinner, he asked me if the baby horse missed his mother. It was the first real question he's asked in months." Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He understood loss, understood the way grief could lock itself around your throat and make even simple words feel impossible. When they entered the barn, he watched Tommy's face light up at the sight of Storm playing in his stall, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Would you like to help me feed him?" Jake asked the boy. "He needs a bottle every few hours, and I could use an assistant." Tommy looked at his mother for permission, and when she nodded, the boy's face broke into the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. He showed Tommy how to hold the bottle at the right angle, how to let Storm set the pace of drinking, how to read the foal's body language to know when he was content or needed comfort. The girl, whose name was Sophie, watched with equally intense focus, asking intelligent questions about horse care and wild animal rehabilitation. While the children were occupied with Storm, the stallion emerged from the shadows of his stall and stood watching the scene with his usual wariness. But something was different this time. Instead of pinning his ears or showing signs of agitation at the presence of strangers, he simply observed with what looked like curiosity. His eyes tracked Tommy's gentle movements with Storm, watched the way the children spoke in soft voices, and moved with careful respect. Amanda noticed too. "He's not afraid of them," she said quietly to Jake. "Why is that?" Jake thought about it for a moment before answering. "I think he recognizes something in them. Children are honest in their emotions in a way adults often aren't. They're genuinely interested and gentle, with no hidden agendas. Wild animals can sense that." As they stood there watching the children interact with Storm, Amanda asked Jake about his own story. He found himself telling her things he rarely shared with anyone, about Rachel leaving, about the years of isolation he had chosen afterward, about how these horses had somehow broken through walls he didn't even realize he had built. Amanda listened without judgment, and when he finished, she offered him a small smile. "My husband used to say that sometimes the things we need most come to us in the most unexpected packages," she said. "I think these horses needed you, but maybe you needed them just as much." Over the next few weeks, Amanda and the children became regular visitors to the ranch. They would come on Saturday mornings, and Jake would let them help with Storm's care while he worked on the stallion's continuing rehabilitation. Tommy had indeed found his voice again, chattering away to Storm about school and his friends and the things he missed about his father. Sophie proved to have a natural gift with animals, showing the kind of patience and intuition that couldn't be taught. Jake found himself looking forward to these visits more than he wanted to admit. Amanda was easy to talk to, her presence bringing a warmth to the ranch that had been missing for too long. She would bring lunch for everyone, and they would sit together in the barn eating sandwiches while the children played nearby and the horses watched with their usual intelligent interest. It wasn't romance, not exactly, but it was connection. And Jake was discovering that maybe that was enough for now. The stallion's transformation was the most remarkable. Slowly, incrementally, he began to accept a wider circle of humans. He would tolerate Amanda's presence near his stall, seemed almost curious about the children's high voices and quick movements. One afternoon in early December, Sophie was sitting on the floor of the barn reading a book aloud to Storm, and Jake noticed the stallion had moved to the front of his stall to listen. The horse stood perfectly still, his ears forward, seemingly entranced by the sound of the girl's voice. "He likes stories," Sophie announced with the confidence of childhood, "just like Storm does. I'm going to read to them every time I visit." And she did. Every Saturday, while Tommy helped Jake with feeding and basic care, Sophie would settle herself on a hay bale with whatever book she was currently reading and share it with the horses. The stallion would stand at his stall door listening, and Storm would press his small body against the rails to be closer to the girl. It was a scene so peaceful and unexpected that it made Jake's chest ache with emotions he couldn't quite name. Dr. Torres came for her monthly inspection in mid-December and was amazed by the progress both horses had made. The stallion's injuries were completely healed, his coat gleaming with health, his body back to the powerful, muscular condition of a wild horse in his prime. Storm had grown tremendously, no longer the weak, starving baby, but a sturdy young horse showing all the promise of his father's strength and intelligence. "They're ready," Dr. Torres said, and Jake felt his heart drop even though he had known this day would come. Physically, they're healthy enough to be released back to the wild. We should start making arrangements for their return to the Pryor mountain range. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "How soon?" "We'll want to wait until early spring. Releasing them in winter would be cruel, and it will give Storm a few more months to grow stronger. But Jake," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "you need to start preparing yourself emotionally. And you need to start preparing them. They've been in captivity for 3 months now. We need to make sure they remember how to be wild." That evening, after Amanda and the children had left and the barn was quiet except for the usual animal sounds, Jake stood at the stallion's stall and felt the weight of impending loss settle over him like a physical thing. He had known from the beginning that this was temporary, that the whole point of his care was to return these horses to their natural lives, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two very different things. The stallion approached the stall door, and for the first time since that initial night in the storm, he stretched his neck out and touched his nose to Jake's hand. It was a gesture of trust, of connection, of gratitude perhaps. Jake felt tears sting his eyes as he gently stroked the horse's soft muzzle, this wild creature who had taught him more about courage and love in 3 months than he had learned in years of careful isolation. Spring came to Montana with its usual dramatic flair, the snow melting almost overnight to reveal ground that was ready to burst with new life. The meadows around Jake's ranch transformed into carpets of wildflowers, purple lupines and yellow arrowleaf balsamroot, painting the landscape in colors so vivid they almost hurt to look at. It was the perfect time for the horses to return to the wild, when food was abundant and the weather was mild enough that they could readjust to their natural lives without the harsh challenges of winter or the scorching heat of summer. Dr. Torres had scheduled the release for a Saturday in early April, arranging for a specialized horse trailer and a team from the Bureau of Land Management to transport the stallion and Storm back to the Pryor mountain range. The plan was to release them near where their original herd had been spotted, giving them the best chance of reuniting with their family or finding a new band to join. Jake spent the final week preparing himself for goodbye, though he knew that no amount of preparation would make it easier. Amanda and the children came every day that week, wanting to spend as much time as possible with the horses who had become so important to their healing. Sophie read her current book to completion, a story about a wild Mustang who saved his herd from danger, and Tommy gave Storm extra treats while fighting back tears he was too young to hide effectively. On the Thursday before the scheduled release, Amanda stayed after the children had reluctantly gone to wait in the truck. She found Jake in the barn, standing at the stallion's stall with his hand resting on the horse's neck. The stallion didn't pull away, had grown comfortable enough with Jake's touch that he would lean into it now, seeking the connection he had once fled from. "You're going to miss them terribly," Amanda said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. The stallion turned his head to look at Amanda with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Jake saw recognition there. This horse understood on some level that change was coming, that the safety and routine of the past months was about to end. "The kids are going to miss them too," Amanda continued, "but I think this has been good for them, learning to love something and then having the courage to let it go, because that's what's best for it. That's a hard lesson, but an important one." Jake thought about her words long after she left. Learning to love something and then having the courage to let it go. That was exactly what he had been unable to do with Rachel, unable to fully love her because he was so afraid of losing her. But with these horses he had loved without reservation, had given everything he had to their care and healing, knowing from the beginning that they would leave. And somehow that complete commitment, that willingness to embrace temporary connection, had healed something broken inside him. The night before the release, Jake slept in the barn one final time. He lay on his cot listening to the familiar sounds that had become the soundtrack of his life over the past months. Storm's soft breathing, the occasional rustle as the stallion shifted position, the gentle sounds of horses at peace. Around 3 a.m, Jake woke to find the stallion standing at his stall door, watching him with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Jake rose and walked to the horse, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then the stallion did something he had never done before. He lowered his great head and rested it against Jake's chest, his breath warm against Jake's shirt, his weight a gentle pressure that spoke of trust earned through patience and care. Jake wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and let himself cry. Great quiet sobs that shook his frame but made no sound. The stallion stood perfectly still, as if he understood that this human who had saved him needed comfort in return. When morning came, it brought with it Dr. Torres and her team, along with what seemed like half the county. Word had spread about the wild horses, and people had come from miles around to witness their return to freedom. Amanda was there with Tommy and Sophie, and Mrs. Patterson had brought what looked like enough food to feed an army. Sheriff Chen arrived in her patrol car, and even some of Jake's more distant neighbors had made the trip to see the horses off. Loading the stallion into the trailer was easier than Jake had expected. The horse walked up the ramp with calm dignity, as if he understood that this was the next step in his journey. Storm followed his father without hesitation, the young horse no longer the weak, starving baby, but a strong, confident foal ready to learn the ways of the wild. Jake secured them both carefully, making sure they had water and hay for the journey, his hands moving through the familiar motions one last time. The drive to the Pryor Mountains took 3 hours, winding through landscape that grew increasingly wild and remote. When they finally reached the release site, Jake's breath caught at the beauty of it. Rolling hills covered in spring grass, rock formations that provided shelter from storms, and in the distance, a small band of Mustangs grazing peacefully. The herd the stallion and Storm had been taken from, still there, still waiting. Dr. Torres opened the trailer doors, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the stallion stepped out onto the grass, his head high, his nostrils flaring as he took in the sense of home. Storm emerged beside him, staying close to his father's protective presence. They stood there for a long moment, two blue roan horses silhouetted against the Montana sky, and Jake felt his heart break and soar simultaneously. The stallion turned back one final time, his eyes finding Jake's across the distance. There was no way to know what the horse was thinking, no way to interpret the intelligence in those dark eyes with any certainty. But Jake chose to believe that the horse was saying thank you and goodbye, and maybe even that the connection they had forged over these months would not be forgotten. Then the stallion tossed his head and broke into a run, Storm galloping at his side, both horses racing toward the distant herd with the pure joy of freedom restored. The other Mustangs raised their heads at the newcomer's approach, and Jake watched through tears as the herd welcomed the stallion and his son back into their ranks. They were home. The drive back to the ranch was quiet. Amanda rode with Jake in his truck, understanding that he needed company, but not conversation. When they arrived at his property, the barn seemed impossibly empty despite the presence of his other horses. The stall where the stallion had stood for months was bare now, the straw clean and fresh, waiting for its next occupant that Jake couldn't imagine ever filling it. But life continued, as it always did. The next Saturday, Amanda and the children came as usual, and Jake discovered that their visits didn't have to end just because the wild horses were gone. Tommy wanted to learn to ride, and Sophie was interested in helping with the other ranch animals. Over time, these visits evolved into something more, something that looked remarkably like the family Jake had once thought he didn't deserve or couldn't protect. 6 months after the release, Dr. Torres called with news. The stallion and Storm had been spotted with their herd, both healthy and thriving. The stallion had reclaimed his position as the band's leader, and Storm was growing into a strong young horse under his father's guidance. They were wild again, truly wild, living the lives they were meant to live. Jake stood on his porch that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains where those horses now ran free. Amanda was in his kitchen making dinner. The children were playing in the yard, and his barn was full of animals that depended on him. His life had become rich and full in ways he never expected, all because one desperate stallion had chosen to trust him on a stormy October night. The injured wild horse had begged him to enter the barn, and what Jake found inside had changed everything. Not just the foal who needed saving, or the evidence that brought criminals to justice, but something far more precious. He had found the courage to love again, to open his heart to connection despite the certainty of loss, to believe that some things were worth the risk of pain. As darkness fell over the ranch, Jake looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky and silently thanked a wild stallion for teaching him the most important lesson of all. That love doesn't diminish when you let it go. It multiplies. That the bravest thing anyone can do is trust again after being broken. And that sometimes the things that save us come on 4 legs in the middle of a storm, asking nothing more than the chance to be seen, understood, and helped.